Welcome back, and we'll move on to the next segment, which is the second virtual roundtable of the event. And again, the experts across the region will meet virtually to discuss facing the challenges of deadly duo in diabetes. To moderate this session, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Dulani Kotahachi, consultant endocrinologist from Sri Lanka, and we'll also be joined by Dr. Rakesh Sahe from India, a senior consultant endocrinologist. Over to you, madam, and over to you, sir.
Thank you. So, welcome to the next virtual roundtable. So, it's going to be about state of the art for the deadly duo in diabetes, CKD and ASCVD. So, we have three eminent speakers today. We have Dr. Sarah Nadeem, Dr. Manisha Sahe, and Dr. Aishwarya Krishnamurthy. May I first introduce the first speaker, Dr. Manisha Sahe. She's a consultant nephrologist, professor and head Department of Nephrology at the Osmania General Hospital and Osmania Medical College, Hyderabad. She'll be speaking to us on prevention of renal events. What do data say? The second speaker would be Professor Sarah Nadeem, Assistant Professor of Medicine and Consultant, Department of Internal Medicine, Section of Endocrinology, the Aga Khan University Hospital, College of Medicine, Karachi, Pakistan. Our third speaker is Dr. Aishwarya Krishnamurthy. She's a consultant in endocrinology and diabetes at Max Hospital in Vaishali, Delhi. So may I invite our moderator, Dr. Rakesh Sahe, to continue with the session. First speaker is Dr. Manisha Sahe. Over to you, Dr. Manisha.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dulani, for the introduction. I just wanted to just give an introduction to the session, and then we could then go on.
Yes, Dr. Rakesh.
Yeah. So I thank the organizers, particularly Dr. Noel and the entire team, for conducting such a wonderful meeting in this pandemic situation where we are able to meet all the KOLs across the region. And congratulations to him. As we move on to this next session, we are speaking about the management of this deadly duo of CKD and ASCVD in patients with type 2 diabetes. So as we know, the prevalence of diabetes is increasing in pandemic proportion. So we have this pandemic of diabetes already going on, and on this we have the pandemic of COVID right now. So we know that in our region, we have a significant increase which is happening in the last few years, and it is predicted to happen in the next few years also. And currently we have close to 88 million people with diabetes. So it's important that we focus on this. And when we look at people with diabetes, what we see is that almost 32% of them have CAD, and and there's a considerable overlap with the presence of atherosclerotic CVD versus heart failure, and then the CKD and CKD in patients with type 2 diabetes. We see that almost 12 to 45% of patients have a heart failure also. So, and then if you look at the patients with heart failure, a lot of them have a risk for developing CKD. Almost 30 to 45% of patients with heart failure develop CKD. And particularly when you look at diabetics with heart failure, almost 60% of them go on to develop CKD. And even if you look at people without ASCVD, almost 20 to 44% of patients of diabetes have CKD. So this is a conglomeration of all these two major comorbidities that we're looking at, and this is the one which these are the ones which cause greatest morbidity and mortality among patients with diabetes. And it's no and to add to this, we also see that subclinical CVD is present in almost more than 2/3 of patients with diabetes, and 2/3 of them are of asymptomatic patients of diabetes have some degree of CAD. And the major impact is that diabetes causes these manifestations, that is atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and heart failure, to manifest much earlier than in non-diabetics. And the extent of and severity of the CAD is also much greater in diabetics. And the presence of CKD multiplies the cardiovascular risk almost by threefold. So these are the major issues that we're dealing with. And when you if you look at the issues regarding CKD, we find that there is fold more higher risk of developing albuminuria and a greater reduction in GFR with the presence of diabetes and higher prevalence of advanced CKD. And several of the genetic predisposing mechanisms are playing a significant role in our population. So these are the challenges that we are seeing, and to overcome this, we see that the important aspect is to bring about better glycemic control and better control of other risk factors, and doing it earlier and providing a better glycemic legacy to our patients is what is the need of the hour. And to discuss these issues today, we have the experts available here, and I hand over now to Dr. Manisha to take over the session and discuss about the evidence available regarding prevention of renal events in patients with diabetes. Over to Dr. Manisha.
So thank you, Safis, for giving me this opportunity. And today I'll be talking about the state-of-art care for deadly DO in diabetes, as Dr. Rakesh already said, CKD and ASCVD, and I'll be covering the CKD aspect of it, prevention of renal events. What does the data say? So my first question is, why is it important to prevent renal events? That's because CKD, DKD is a huge burden. CKD impacts 1 in 10 people globally. That's a huge number, 10% of the world population. 2.6 million of world population is on renal replacement therapy, and 1.2 million, huge number, dies per year because of CKD. The commonest cause of CKD, as you can see in the pie chart, is diabetes globally. 42% of CKD is diabetic CKD. What about India? In India, around 17% of the population has CKD, which is again a huge percentage. The commonest cause of CKD in India also is diabetic kidney disease, and every year 2 lakh patients, new patients, are added on dialysis. So it's a huge burden globally as well as in India. What's the second reason we should try to prevent CKD? That's because CKD, DKD is a CV risk factor. And how so? As you can see, the risk of morbidity and mortality rises sharply as the CKD progresses. The rate for hospitalization is multiplied 10 times, cardiovascular events 20 times, and death from any cause 20 times again. So CKD is a huge risk multiplier. So that's the second reason why we should prevent CKD. The third important reason why we should try to prevent CKD is treatment is available. You may argue we have dialysis, we have transplant. I do agree, treatment is available, but it's a whole lot expensive. Transplant is $5,000 US. The maintenance therapy after transplant is $200 US per month. That is lifelong. Dialysis is also not cheap. And the maintenance of the CKD population consumes major portion of health budget of any country. So that's the third reason. It's a huge economic burden as well. The fourth reason, and most important of them all, is we should try to prevent CKD because though we may not be able to totally avoid it, the progression can be definitely retarded. We can slow the progression, and also we know the pathogenesis to a large extent, and we know where and how to intervene. So that's the fourth most important reason. As I said, progression is slow. You can see in the inset there, progresses over 20 to 30 years, passes through different stages. You have hyperfiltration, latent stage, albuminuria stage, proteinuria stage, ESKD stage. Though these are very clear in type 1 diabetes, in type 2 diabetes, these are not very clear, but still we have some interval where if we screen early and pick up early, we can have time to intervene. Also, as I said, the pathogenesis is clear. In a nutshell, the pathogenesis of kidney disease in diabetes is because of hyperglycemia. This we can control by controlling the glycemic status of the individual. The second important progressor is systemic hypertension. Again, we have antihypertensive drugs available. Third important thing is pro-inflammatory, inflamed oxidative stress in diabetes, which leads to CKD. Again, RAS blockers, avoidance of smoking and avoidance of toxic insults helps here. Obesity is one of the risk factors, and diet and exercise can be used here. Dyslipidemia has a role in progression, and again, we have therapy to counter this as well. And again, the role of hyperfiltration and intraglomerular hypertension, and we have a lot new drugs available in this arena as well. So preventing renal events includes targeting all these mechanisms: the control of hypertension, glycemic control, diet, role of lipids, exercise, avoidance of smoking, avoidance of nephrotoxins, and newer therapies. Now we start with a case, type 2 diabetic, 49 years old, no hypertension, no albuminuria. He's a diabetic for the last 2 years. Blood pressure is fine, as I said. He's on metformin, 1000 mg BD. The HbA1c is 7, no microalbuminuria. So can we do a risk reduction for this individual as far as CKD is concerned? Can we start something? Would you like to start something for this patient? Should you give ACE ARBs for primary prevention? This is a frequently asked question. Diabetic, non-hypertensive, no albuminuria. Should you add RAS blockade? And the evidence says, what does the data say? No. Because as per the results of Direct Protect trial, there was no difference between placebo or ARB in such a patient. And as of now, the evidence doesn't support adding any therapy at this stage. This patient, over a period of time, develops microalbuminuria. The BP is fairly okay. Microalbuminuria, we call it albuminuria now, moderately increased albuminuria, 290. So what do we do here? Will you add RAS blockade? If yes, which RAS blockade? What does the data say? Yes, we will add RAS blockade. The next question is which one? ACE inhibitor or ARB? The data says that the RAS blockade can be added at different stages of progression of diabetic kidney disease, and either ACE or ARB can be added. As you can see, non-mode to microalbuminuria, you have Benedict and Roadmap trial. From micro to overt nephropathy, again, IRMA and Innovation trial. And overt nephropathy to end-stage kidney disease, you have renal and IDNT. So across the progression of CKD, DKD, there is sufficient evidence for RAS blockade for preventing the progression of renal disease. So yes, this patient, once he develops microalbuminuria, you add RAS blockade. This is a beautiful representation of how the RAS blockade, it prevents declining GFR. It helps you gain some years free of dialysis. The next question, what I asked, ACE or ARB? The ones in red say ACE, the ones in black say ARB. But what's the consensus opinion? Use either of them, either ACE inhibitor or ARB. What about different ARBs? Which one do we use? Are different ACE inhibitors equal? Different studies have shown different things, but what's the consensus? Use any of them, but use them appropriately. What about combination? Do we combine them together? Double benefit maybe? So initial trials, CALM, Variety, they said, yes, combination may be more protective. However, now the evidence is very clear. After Vanifron, on target and altitude, combination of RAS, ACE plus ARB or direct renin inhibitor is a definite no-no. Do not combine ACE inhibitor or ARB. And how do we start these ACE or ARBs? This is KDIGO 2020 Diabetic Kidney Disease Guidelines. You check the initial creatinine potassium, start the drug, monitor after 2 to 4 weeks. If normokalemia and the creatinine is less than 30% increase, continue, increase the dose to the maximum tolerated dose. Hyperkalemia, check the other medications. Put the patient on low potassium diet, consider adding potassium losing diuretics, sodium bicarbonate, cation exchanges, meaning do everything to reduce the hyperkalemia. In case that works, fine. Continue with the ACE or ARB. If it doesn't work, then reduce the dose or stop as the last resort. If there is an increase of more than 30% in creatinine, what do we do? Again, look for the cause of increase, other causes apart from ACE, ARB. Look for dehydration, look for diuretic use, consider renal artery stenosis. If we have ruled out everything and still the rise in creatinine persists, then you may have to reduce the dose or stop it altogether. So the bottom line in this slide is try to use ACE or ARB as far as possible, reducing all the other nephrotoxic insults. Stop them only as a last resort. So we got it. Whenever albuminuria is there, add ACE or ARB. Now this patient became hypertensive. What do you do now? What is your target BP in this patient? And what drug will you use to attain this target BP? What do the guidelines say? What does the data say? The answer is less than 130/80. This patient also had albuminuria, therefore 130/80. But my answer is supported by what data? There is sufficient data available. Different guidelines, they focus on different hypertensive targets. The American guideline says that irrespective of proteinuria, 130/80 is the BP you should aim for. JNC says 140/90, liberal target. KDIGO, our kidney guideline says with proteinuria 130/80, without proteinuria 140/90. Similarly, the European guidelines, they have liberalized the target 140/90. We follow the KDIGO guidelines 140/90 without proteinuria and 130/80 with proteinuria. Why there is a difference in guidelines? This is because the ones in green, they are the renal trials. They have little bit less strict goals. Whereas the ones in pink are the cardiovascular outcome trials, SPRINT and ACCORD, they have stricter goals. So the American guidelines, they are more focused on cardiovascular outcomes and hence recommend 130/80 for all with or without proteinuria. If you're able to do that, well and good. So we have understood for this patient, we need to control the blood pressure. Blood pressure is high. He is already on telmisartan 40, which we added for albuminuria. So what should we do? We can go to the highest approved dose. We can increase the dose to 80 milligram per day for telmisartan. Fine, even that doesn't control BP. What is the next step? What does the data say? It says ACE or ARB, do not use combination. Is still uncontrolled, then you can add calcium channel blocker, dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker, then diuretic. Diuretic, if the GFR is more than 30, add thiazide. If the GFR is less than 30, add loop diuretic. The next drug is mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, then beta blocker, and then alpha blocker. So again, we follow the antihypertensive drug guidelines depending on special indications. Those are to be kept in mind. But if nothing else is there, this is the order we follow in patients of CKD. Which drug, ACE, ARB, first choice is shown by umpteen number of trials. And these trials have compared RAS blockade versus CCB for control of hypertension. And they say they afford 30% greater reduction in albuminuria and GFR decline versus CCB. So the choice of drug, the second question, hypertension, what drug? RAS blockade in appropriate dose. You can add the others in the order I showed. So that was about management of albuminuria and management of hypertension. What about hyperglycemia management? This patient becomes uncontrolled on metformin. You want to prevent microvascular complications in future. What HbA1c target you should aim for and what drugs should you use to get to that target? So the KDIGO 2020 recommendation is it should be individualized HbA1c less than 6.5 for those who are young, those who have less comorbidities, those who are at less risk for hypoglycemia or are able to manage hypoglycemia well and have a good life expectancy, strict target less than 6.5. If those who are elderly, frail, they have comorbidities and they cannot manage hypoglycemia, short life expectancy, go slow, less than 8. We know that good glycemic control delays the onset of complications, decreases the overall cost of diabetes management. Dr. Rakesh also showed that legacy effect, which early control of sugar has. Every single HbA1c points matter. So you can see the microvascular disease drops by around 1/3 by a significant 1% drop in HbA1c. So we have understood managing HbA1c is important. And I told you 6.5 or 8 depending upon the patient profile. And what does the data say about that? So this data is based on evidence from the UKPDS follow-up study, EDIC study, ACCORD, ADVANCE, and VADT. And says 6.5 for younger, 8 for the older individuals. Fine. HbA1c we understood. How to monitor HbA1c? In CKD, is it different? It's different because HbA1c may be falsely low because of hemolysis, blood loss. In fact, it may be high also because of carbamylation of hemoglobin, because carbamylated hemoglobin also behaves like HbA1c. And the machines pick it up similarly. So what is the dictum? Should we use HbA1c? Yes, still HbA1c should be used despite all the fallacies. Do it twice per year. You can do 4 times per year if not achieving target. And in case you have doubt about HbA1c, continuous glucose monitoring is now coming into play in CKD patients. Fine, we have decided the target. We have decided how to monitor it, which drug. We know we used to choose the drug depending upon the HbA1c reduction it offers, the risk of hypoglycemia, weight, the GFR of the individual, and cost. So these were the traditional things in our mind when we were choosing the drugs. This is the glycemic wheel which we used to follow. And the latest guidelines say that in type 2 diabetes, even CKD patients with GFR more or equal to 30, metformin is recommended as the first line therapy for hyperglycemia. So far, so good. How to use metformin? Less than 30, do not use it. In case the GFR is more than 60, use it and monitor the GFR annually. If the GFR is between 45 to 59, use it, monitor GFR more frequently, at least 3 to 6 monthly. And if GFR is 30 to 44, be more cautious and start with half the dose. So this is the metformin recommendation, how to use in CKD. Now, what governs the choice of glycemic status management now is organ protection, which has come after the spate of trials we had in the last decade. So hyperglycemia is not the only goal. Organ protection is important, CV protection as well as renal protection. And we have had outcome trials, renal and CV outcome trials. We are all aware with CV outcomes, which look at MACE, 3-point MACE, 4-point MACE. Renal outcome trials looked at decline of GFR, doubling of creatinine, ESKD, and renal death, albuminuria, new onset or reduction in existent albuminuria. So these are the renal outcome trials. So what sort of trials we had? We had a lot of trials on 3 drugs, SGLT2, GLP-1 agonists, and DPP-4 inhibitors. So coming to the first drug, SGLT2, how is it renoprotective? It's renoprotective because it reduces hyperfiltration. Hyperfiltration is the culprit in causing renal damage. You can see as the remaining number of nephrons filter more and more, they also get damaged. So hyperfiltration is the basic culprit which causes progression of renal disease. Now, SGLT2, how do they reduce hyperfiltration? We know that they act independent of insulin, they act through the kidney, they act on the proximal tubule. And what do they do in the proximal tubule? They block the hyperfiltration. How do they do it? In diabetics, we have increased glomerular filtration and increased absorption. You can see sodium and glucose is absorbed in the proximal tubule. So there is less sodium delivered to the distal tubule. So macula densa realizes that it is getting less sodium, less fluid. So it tells the afferent arteriole, filter more blood. So afferent arteriole vasodilates and there is more blood coming into the glomerulus. There is intraglomerular hypertension and increased filtration. So this is what happens. Now, how do SGLT2 act? SGLT2, they block the sodium glucose resorption in the proximal tubule. The sodium is delivered to the distal tubule, and as a result, there is constriction of the afferent arteriole. This reduces the intraglomerular pressure and the filtration. They also have tubular effects, anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic, antioxidant. And as a result, they are weight reducing, reduce BP, cardioprotective, decrease hyperfiltration, smart diuretics, decrease albuminuria, decrease renal work, and cytokines. So good drugs for renoprotection. And this is supported by data. We have trials. The ones in green are the primary CV outcome trials where the renal outcomes were secondary and they included patients with mild renal disease. The ones in red, CREDENS and DAPA-CKD, are primary renal outcome trials and they have included patients with advanced CKD as well. And this table says it all. I'm not going into the detail, but see the figures at the bottom. EMPA-REG, CANVAS, and DECLARE, 30 to 40% renal risk reduction, where the renal outcome was secondary renal outcome. In CREDENCE, where the primary outcome was renal outcome, again, there was a 30% reduction in the renal events. Strong data. This is data from EMPIRIC trial. The secondary renal outcome trial, you can see figures are very good. This is CREDENCE data, again 30% renal risk reduction, stabilization of albuminuria, less GFR decline. And DAPA-CKD. How is DAPA-CKD different from CREDENCE? It's with dapagliflozin, and it included non-diabetic patients as well. So diabetic as well as non-diabetic CKD, use of SGLT2, DAPA reduces the renal endpoints. So this is a new nephroprotective agent. So this is the latest guideline from KDIGO. After metformin, add SGLT2. Withhold SGLT2 if there is critical illness. Reduce the dose of thiazide diuretic if there is risk for hypovolemia. SGLT2 may cause a reversible decline in GFR, but that's not the indication to stop therapy. Even after starting SGLT2, if GFR comes below 30, still you can continue, but do not initiate with a GFR less than 30. So SGLT2 are important drugs. What about GLP-1 analogs? They also reduce the glomerular intra pressure inside the glomerulus, are anti-inflammatory. Again, we have trial evidence. What does the data say? The LEADER trial, liraglutide, SUSTAIN trial, semaglutide, and you have REWIND and AWARD trial with dulaglutide. These are the renal outcome trials, and again, a 30% risk reduction in renal events. So what is the guideline now? Type 2 diabetic with CKD not achieve glycemic targets despite metformin and SGLT2 inhibitors. What you should do? We can add GLP-1 receptor antagonist. So this GLP-1 RA should be used after SGLT2 inhibitors. The risk of hypoglycemia is generally low, but you should be careful when you are using it with sulfonylurea or insulin. You may have to reduce that dose. And DPP-4 inhibitors should not be combined with GLP-1 RA. What about DPP-4? Any renoprotective evidence? How do they act? They act by increasing the level of GLP-1. Are there trial data to show their efficacy? Yes, there are. You have SAVOR-TIMI, EXAMINE, and TCOS, but the randomized controlled trial, CARMELINA, which was out recently, showed that there was reduction in microvascular composite outcomes. Though the GFR effect was not robust, significant effect was on albuminuria, 14% albuminuria reduction. So what is the guideline now? After lifestyle, diet, metformin, if the patient has CKD, you add SGLT2 as the second drug after metformin. And in case still not controlled, GLP-1 RA may be used. If no, you can go for any drug choice of therapy. Same holds true for ASCVD. The third important point, we talked about hypertension and proteinuria. So diet therapy, healthy diet, rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, reduce refined carbohydrates, reduce processed meats, and reduce sweetened beverages. Protein 0.8 gram per kg per day. People feel that protein restriction causes muscle loss. It's not so. If you restrict the protein from 1.1 to 0.55, the recycled protein increases, degradation is reduced. So urea generation is reduced. You can see 34% degradation, 24% degradation, and 14%. Recycling increases, muscle mass is maintained. But when you reduce the protein to 0.45 gram per kg, you need to add essential amino acids. Thus, protein restriction works. And this, we have written a paper on that, nutrition in chronic kidney disease. We have to use 0.8 gram per kg, as I said. Be aware of protein content of foodstuffs. Booklets are available. Egg contains how much, fish contains how much, we have to know that. Vegetable protein is better, egg protein is better, and we should also look at protein phosphate ratio, especially in CKD. Egg has a favorable protein phosphate ratio, high protein, less phosphorus. Whey protein seems to be better. Animal protein, no. Plant protein, yes. Egg protein remains the best. What about salt in diet? We know less than 2 grams of sodium per day in diabetic CKD. This is supported by data as well, though the quality of evidence is weak for progression of CKD, stronger for CV events. Any type of salt table salt, sena namak, kala namak, sea salt, everything, the bottom line remains less than 2 grams per day. Some studies show that sea salt may be a bit better, but low sodium salt has high potassium and may not work in CKD. And how to reduce salt, you have 10 steps. So you know that avoid processed food, eat fresh fruit instead of chips as snacks, avoid sauces, avoid soya, use unsalted butter, use fresh spices, lime, tamarind, etc., and learn to read the labels. So if you see the Pringles labels, 2,400 milligram of sodium in this should not be taken. As I said, avoid more than 400 milligram of salt in any single dish. So this contains 2,400. The next important intervention is statins in CKD. So here the KDIGO says all adults above or equal to age of 50 years with CKD, statins should be a part of the prescription, except those on dialysis. And what about younger than 50? All diabetic CKD patients from 18 to 49 years also need a statin. So statins are very important drugs in CKD for retardation of renal disease progression as well as CV risk reduction. And we have special calculators for CV risk in CKD. They are different from ASCVD or score calculators. We talk about patch method. Patch method is they have been recalibrated for CKD and these are available now. The fifth component is exercise. More than 150 minutes per week is recommended for diabetic CKD patients. Type of exercise can be strength training or heavy exercise depending upon the patient type. Sixth important prevention measure is avoiding nephrotoxic insults. NSAIDs should be avoided, and contrast studies should be done only if essential. Proper hydration should be maintained. NAC, the N-acetyl cysteine, evidence is not very clear. Use very small quantity of low or isoosmolar contrast, and completely avoid MRI if the GFR is less than 30. So the sixth important renal event reduction method is avoid nephrotoxic insults. Seventh is smoking cessation, and here I would like to highlight active smoking as well as passive smoking. Both should be stopped. Passive smoking should also be looked at. We don't take that history usually. The last intervention is newer drugs. You can see the ones in green, ACE and ARBs we've talked about. All other therapies, the combo therapy, the direct renin inhibitor, the celedoxide and bardoxolone methyl, all were failures. But the new data is emerging on finrenone in reducing kidney failure and disease progression in diabetic CKD, Fidlio DKD, where they have used renal outcomes as primary outcomes and CV outcomes are the secondary outcomes, and good data is coming that it is renoprotective. We have a SONAR trial which was released at the same time as Credence trial with atrasentan, which gives a weak signal for improving diabetic nephropathy. So this is the last slide. So this is the last slide now of the presentation, where I have summed up all the therapies: glycemic control, RAS blockade, blood pressure control, lipid management, lifestyle, smoking, and nutrition. Aspirin, there is no role for primary prevention in prevention of CKD. So where does our patient fare here? He is in the middle part. He has already developed microalbuminuria. So primary prevention could have been prevention of development of microalbuminuria. Prevent, this should be the goal by screening high-risk people. Those who already develop the microvascular complications, we should try to regress so that they don't progress further, which I have talked about. And if they enter ESRD despite our best efforts, that would be tertiary prevention. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for a patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Manisha, for the comprehensive coverage of all the data that is showing us about all the various aspects that have to be addressed while we are looking at preventing renal disease in patients with diabetes. Now we'll move on to the next presentation by Dr. Sara. Dr. Sara Nadeem is going to speak about the data that is available for prevention of cardiovascular events.
Thank you, Dr. Rakesh. Let me just pull up my slide here. Okay, try again. So Dr. Manisha's excellent comprehensive talk almost makes my talk, I can whiz through that because she has provided a lot of the information I'm trying here. So as this loads, let me just share that I'll be talking about the prevention of cardiovascular event data and what the data and the most recent guidelines talk about. Okay. Are you able to see the share screen?
No, not yet.
Okay. There we go. I think it's pulling up now.
Yeah.
Okay. So the background has been laid and quite a bit of comprehensive information shared by Dr. Manisha, as I was referring to. I don't have any disclosures. This is the talk outline. We'll be talking about cardiovascular events in diabetes. Some of the background Dr. Rakesh touched on the burden of disease, as well as talking about primary and secondary prevention. And we are talking here about primary cardiovascular risk reduction and secondary cardiovascular risk reduction. And then which diabetes medicines and what the data and the evidence-based guidelines guide us about cardiovascular risk reduction in diabetics. So let me minimize this. There we go. So cardiovascular events in diabetes, as Dr. Rakesh detailed, that the burden of disease is quite high. All of us participants here from South Asia are well aware that it is a major burden, not only all over the world, but particularly in the Asian region. Over 68% of people who are above the age of 65, or seniors as we call them, who have diabetes will die from some form of heart disease. And 16% will die of cerebrovascular accident or stroke. So that combined is why the importance of cardiovascular risk is so important. We may be controlling the sugars well, but we have, except for the last decade or so, only now started looking at how can we now have the tools to be able to address the cardiovascular risk directly. So adults with diabetes are 2 to 4 times more likely to die from heart disease than adults without diabetes. The American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association has a risk calculator, which is the first thing I teach my endocrine fellows to use and estimate the 10-year atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk. But as Dr. Rakesh Sahib pointed out quite correctly, its applicability to our South Asian population and the local factors, including diet and otherwise, does not take that into account. And the other thing which it does not take into account, which as an endocrinologist and who manages diabetes patients, is that it does not take into account the duration of diabetes or the presence of diabetes complications, which we all are aware of that does increase the cardiovascular risk as well. So when you do use the heart AHA risk calculator, take it with a pinch of salt, knowing that you may be underestimating the risk if you are applying it in South Asia and in diabetics. So screening. The first thing to start with cardiovascular risk is, do we screen all our diabetes patients for cardiovascular disease? Currently, the data and the American Diabetes Association recommends against screening all diabetes patients for coronary artery disease risk, as it has not been shown to improve outcomes related to atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk factors. But the caveat here is that if you are treating those risk factors, and some of those Dr. Manisha had alluded to, and I will go through them step by step. So we do not need to do cardiac stress tests on everybody who is asymptomatic. So the key word here is asymptomatic diabetes patients. If there is a symptomatic diabetic patient, obviously you should be doing cardiovascular screening. But in asymptomatic diabetic patients, the first job that we have is to reduce the cardiovascular risk by addressing all of the cardiovascular risk factors, as I will go into detail. So what are the major cardiovascular risk factors? And I'm assuming, we talked the hyperglycemia management, you've had earlier talks this morning. That is an assumption that is assumed that we are obviously focusing on the glycemic levels. As Dr. Manisha also mentioned about the HbA1c targets and the glycemic targets, we are all aware of that. This talk is going to focus on the other cardiovascular risk factors, which include hypertension, weight or obesity management, lipids. And then in the end, we'll talk about the medications. So what does ADS say? It says patients who have known atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease consider an ACE inhibitor or an ARB to reduce the risk of cardiovascular events. Now, in evidence-based guidelines, you will see evidence when there is more of expert opinion, less of meta-analyses and trials. The recommendation would be suggest, consider, and so forth. And then when it is strong evidence, there is the terminology of should be used. So that is how I would like you to consider that, is that says consider ACE inhibitor ARBs to reduce risk of cardiovascular events with known atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Second, in patients who have a prior myocardial infarct, beta blockers should be continued for at least 2 years after the event. Now, obviously, we do have cardiologists following our patients who've had an MI, and that's continued. But if you are the primary care physician or you identify a patient who has had an MI in the last 2 years and is not taking beta blockers consistently, it is our responsibility to ensure that these guidelines are followed. So this is a very nice overview of by the American Diabetes Association of how to start with blood pressure management. Okay, initial blood pressure, and Dr. Manisha has talked about what the kidney guidelines are. This is from the American Diabetes Association, more of an endocrine-based, is that if the initial blood pressure is about 140/90 and once between 140 and 160 systolic and 90 and 100 diastolic, you start with one agent. You look at albuminuria, yes or no. Yes to albuminuria, you start ACE or ARB. And as has been detailed before, if no albuminuria, you could have your choice of drugs. On the right side, if the initial blood pressure is quite elevated, above 160/100, then it is important to start 2 agents directly. Again, with albuminuria, or no, the absence of albuminuria, you can decide that. And then always assess BP control and adverse effects, reevaluate in 2 weeks if they're ACE inhibitors, potassium levels, and also to see if they're achieving target or not. I tell my patients, as important as it is for you to check your blood glucose, it's also important for you to keep your blood pressure diary as well until their blood pressures are stable and well controlled. So that walks you down here about whether you need to up titrate or consider changes in medicine if patient is either not meeting target or has adverse effects to the initial medications that you've prescribed. Now, let's talk about obesity. Remember, we said hypertension, obesity, and lipids. So we talked about the blood pressure, cardiovascular risk reduction element. Now for the weight. Lifestyle modification focusing on weight loss. And what that entails is both diet and activity. So the DASH diet is recommended, as well as the Mediterranean diet, which has been elucidated, reduction of saturated and trans fats, increase in dietary omega-3 fatty acids, more plant sterol intake, and increased physical activity, which we should be. A lot of times we end up saying that the first couple of times, and when we realize that the patient is not following, we give up on that. But a couple of interventions have been shown to be quite helpful, which is the presence of either a dietitian and a physical therapist in a multidisciplinary endocrine clinic, which I'm fortunate to be a part of at AKU, where we have both. We have a dietitian as well as a physical therapist there to assist. Sometimes the endocrinologist may not have the tools available, and to have a multidisciplinary visit like that really helps in patient following these recommendations in terms of lifestyle. So coming to lipids, how do we manage the lipids? First thing is check the lipids, right? First, check lipid profile at diabetes diagnosis. All too often we see, particularly type 2, who have been diagnosed for years and may not have had a lipid profile done at diagnosis. It's important to have a baseline diagnosis. Then, at initiation of statins or other lipid-lowering therapy, and then recheck 4 to 12 weeks after initiation or anytime you change the dose, because you do want to see if you are achieving target or not. Once you have achieved that, you may do that annually thereafter, as long as the patient is tolerating as well. So, do we use statins for primary prevention in diabetics? Yes and no. So the first point, if you are a diabetic or you have a diabetic patient aged between 40 to 75 years of age who does not have vascular disease, you use moderate intensity statin in addition to lifestyle therapy. If you have a younger patient with diabetes who has additional atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, you may use and start statin therapy in addition to lifestyle therapy. But again, it may be reasonable. These are words coming from guidelines which suggest that we don't have very strong data, but expert opinion suggests that it would be reasonable. In higher risk diabetics or older age diabetics, it is reasonable to use high intensity statin therapy. Now, what is important to see here is that these are diabetes guidelines. from the American Diabetes Association. The American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association guidelines actually recommend high-dose statin for patients who are diabetics and have higher cardiovascular risk for the next 10 years. So the ADA is a little bit conservative here. We're saying you can start a moderate intensity statin as well. Obviously, people with known disease, you would have them on maximally tolerated statin therapy, as my last point shows. Secondary prevention that we're talking about, all diabetics, all ages with cardiovascular disease. There is no controversy here between ADA and the American Heart Association. High intensity statin therapy should be added. There is no ifs or buts or suggestion, it is should, because the data is quite strong there. And diabetics with cardiovascular disease who are considered very high risk, if their LDL cholesterol is over or equal to 70, you may consider adding an additional LDL lowering agent, which could, for cost, be estimable, or PCSK9 inhibitors, which have exorbitant cost. And now coming to antiplatelets. So there has been quite a bit of a shift in the last 2 decades over the use of aspirin therapy in primary prevention. And currently, we do not recommend primary prevention aspirin therapy. Again, the terminology ADA has kind of failed to commit to one either way, but it has said you may consider it, but it is not recommended as a general guideline anymore. This is the modification to the recommendations. Obviously, a secondary prevention strategy, that's a no-brainer, that is recommended. So a patient who has had a heart attack, you would give them aspirin. Patient who has not had a heart attack and is diabetic, you would not routinely prescribe aspirin therapy unless they have multiple other risk factors. Now, let's focus on the diabetes medicines, which are actually the glucose-lowering agents, which also affect the cardiovascular risk. So I'll start with DPP-4 inhibitors. Initially, there has been no benefit seen in terms of cardiovascular risk reduction, and we have multiple studies. But just earlier, we had data from the Carmelina trial, which showed that it is non-inferior, okay, despite, and that it has lower rates of hypoglycemia. So initially, there was like, there's no benefit and may actually be inferior, but the Carmelina shows it as non-inferiority between a DPP inhibitor, DPP-4 inhibitor, linagliptin, and a sulfonylurea on cardiovascular outcome data. Now, GLP-1 agonists. These are subcutaneous injections, which are taken either once a day, once a week, and we are having longer acting ones available as the medications are developed. Liraglutide, dulaglutide, abiliglutide, and semaglutide lowers the risk of cardiovascular events in a moderate sized clinical trial, but this was not powered for cardiovascular outcomes data. So I will not go into each and every one in detail, but when you see here, looking at lixisenatide, liraglutide, semaglutide, I'll go with the ones that have shown data. It's right here. They have shown that A1C inclusion criteria initially was all above 7, except for the Excel trial, exenatide, which was between 6.5% and 10%. And there was reduction in cardiovascular death rate in all of these. Now, SGLT2 inhibitors have the advantage that they're available in oral form. They're a little bit cheaper than GLP-1 agonists, at least in our part of the region, so better tolerated and better affordability. And SGLT2 inhibitors have been shown to cause significant improvement and reduction in cardiovascular events for empagliflozin, canagliflozin, and dapagliflozin, based on the EMPA-REG, CANVAS, and the DECLARE-TIMI trial. Now, the DAPA-HF trial is the other one that I'm going to come to in a minute, was targeted not just for diabetics, it included diabetics and non-diabetics. And that led to the American College of Cardiology updating their guidelines. So I find it very interesting that now renal guidelines as well as cardiology guidelines are educating cardiologists and nephrologists about glycemic control as well as the choice of the right diabetic medicine, because all of the patients who are diabetic sometimes do not end up seeing an endocrinologist or a general internist, and their first point of contact may be the nephrologist or the cardiologist based on if they have CKD or if they have an MI. And so I think this is a very welcome move for all of us to be working together because our ultimate goal is to reduce the events in our patients. And whoever does that, as long as we are able to provide education to everybody, is most important. So the DAPA-HF trial that I was referring to is a placebo-controlled trial, which evaluated the effects of the SGLT2 inhibitor, dapagliflozin. And as Dr. Manisha's slide has detailed what the mechanism of action of that, I will not go into it. And it studied its effect on the composite of worsening heart failure or cardiovascular death in patients with New York Heart Association class 2 to 4 heart failure and a low ejection fraction of 40% or less. And 45% of these 4,700 trial participants had a history of type 2 diabetes. So the majority did not have diabetes. And this was very important and key because this is a medicine which originally started as a glucose lowering agent, which it still is, but now its use and its indications by the FDA are expanding to non-diabetics for heart failure as well as CKD patients. So they saw that over a median of 18.2 months, the group that was assigned to DAPA had a lower risk of the primary outcome, which was worsening heart failure or cardiovascular death, and an overall lower risk of cardiovascular death compared to placebo. So in type 2 patients who have established heart failure and reduced ejection fraction, an SGLT2 inhibitor is without a doubt the first choice to reduce the risk of worsening heart failure and cardiovascular death. And this trial has shown now that in this patient population, this is a class effect and not just a diabetes-related effect. So this is the 2020 expert consensus decision pathway on novel therapies for cardiovascular risk reduction by the American College of Cardiology and endorsed by the American Diabetes Association, which just recently came out. Which talks about how when you start with a patient who is over 18 years old with type 2 diabetes and has more than one of the following, either atherosclerotic vascular disease, heart failure, or kidney disease, and it is at high risk for cardiovascular disease in the future, you have to address concurrently, not just glucose, not just lifestyle, not just blood pressure, not just lipids. You have to do it all together, right? So optimize guideline-directed medical therapy for lifestyle, blood pressure, lipids, glucose, antiplatelet, which I walked you through, and recommend starting an SGLT2 inhibitor or a GLP-1 agonist with proven cardiovascular benefit, depending on the patient's specific factors, obviously personalizing therapy and comorbidities, okay? Again, discussing patient-clinician preferences and priorities is important, particularly in our part of the region, where we have to take into account a lot of different factors, including cost, the patient's access to care and follow-up, and the understanding of the patient, as well as compliance. So as they said, you can choose SGLT2 or GLP-1 and then reassess and consider the addition of the alternative. So using one and you feel like they can be on another diabetic agent and their A1C is above goal, above 7%, then you can add the other one. So that is my goal always in practice, is start with one of these and then try and put the other one on if needed as the second step rather than any other agent. So to summarize, the American Diabetes Association has made these recommendations, and at the end, the letter A, and C tell you what the strength of data and research trial data is. So diabetes patients with established disease, cardiovascular disease, multiple heart disease risk factors, or diabetes-related kidney disease, a sodium glucose SGLT2 inhibitor with demonstrated heart benefit is recommended to reduce their major cardiovascular events and rate of hospitalization for heart failure, which was something which previously none of our medications were able to achieve. And so this is a breakthrough in the last decade that we've all seen. And type 2 patients with established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or multiple risk factors for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a GLP-1 agonist also with demonstrated cardiovascular benefit is recommended. So again, they're pretty much equal in terms of the ADA. And patients who have heart failure and type 2 diabetes with or without atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease known, then this SGLT2 inhibitor, based on expert opinion, is the first line recommendation. What does ACE say? I have shown you the American College of Cardiology guidelines. the American Diabetes Association guidelines, and then American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists has something similar. I find this slide to be quite helpful because it walks everyone through from internists to any other specialty related. It simplifies things. So when you're in clinic and you don't remember what the data may be, this is one slide. If you can even Google it right away, you can quickly find out and have a good discussion with the patient and make the right choice for your patient. Okay, so lifestyle therapy, obviously, and their target is less than or equal to 6.5% A1C. ADA's is less than or equal to 7% A1C. Obviously, that target can be modified based on the comorbidities. So lifestyle therapy, ongoing glucose monitoring. I'm a big fan of diabetes technology. Continuous glucose monitor is able to give you more data in 24 hours than self-monitoring ever can. We do have some CGMs available, but the cost is quite high for our country. But as the cost comes down, I think we will be shifting away from glucose monitoring by finger stick to CGM in dialysis patients, in inpatient, as well as outpatient, which is the current indication. So based on where their entry A1C is, obviously the first line is still metformin. Here, entry A1C between 7.5 to 9%, dual therapy, triple therapy, you will see GLP-1 and SGLT2 inhibitors are always right up there, right after metformin. Okay, so I won't walk you through this, but this is a good, all you have to remember to do is just Google ACE 2020 guidelines or ADA, most recent diabetes standards, to have that accessible to you. So in summary, we should know and remember what are the risk factors for cardiovascular disease in diabetic patients or in all patients, which was, we're talking about high blood pressure, lipids, weight, and the need for anticoagulant therapy, antiplatelet therapy or not, based on whether that's primary or secondary prevention. What is the data on cardiovascular risk reduction by diabetes medications? And I think if there's one running thread in all of our talks, it's that there are multiple strong trials supporting SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 agonists for cardiovascular risk reduction, as well as renal benefits in our diabetic population. And they also reduce blood glucose. Remember, we're also treating the diabetes. And type 2 patient management guidelines based on data. The ADA and ACE guidelines are the ones that I would recommend you to. But obviously, if your own specialty, if you're a cardiologist, the American College of Cardiology has also developed guidelines, as I showed you, endorsed by the ADA, and Dr. Manisha shared the nephrology guidelines as well. Thank you, and that's just a picture from the Aga Khan University. Now, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Sara, for the very excellent presentation where you discussed about all the cardiovascular outcome trials, and you discussed about the risk factor management for each of the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So having looked at these two aspects, I think we'll move on to a case, illustrative case, which Dr. Aishwarya will be presenting. And while we do that, we'll have some polls for the audience, and we'll also take up questions which are coming up in the chat box and discuss these aspects. So over to Dr. Aishwarya to take us through the case.
So thank you so much, sir. Right. So after those really nice talks by Dr. Nadeem and Dr. Sahai, we just have a clinical case challenge, just to walk us through how to apply what they have told us over the last 1 hour to a patient. How do we do that? For that, we have a case challenge. We have a few questions in between for the audience, so please feel free to take part in the poll. So this is a case challenge, so where we'll be trying and applying emerging data to patient care. I'm sure this will be useful to many of the young clinicians like us, where we're trying to use all the data that's available to our patients when we are seeing them. So without much ado, I'll start the case. So this is a case analysis of a 65-year-old lady. She's a retired school teacher. So this patient has been with us since the age of 47, at which she had her first presentation. So she was diagnosed with diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia, incidentally, on a routine health checkup at the age of 47. So this patient had a significant family history of diabetes and CKD in her father. She did not have any other medical comorbidity. She did not give history of any medication intake. There was nothing else to suggest a secondary diabetes. She didn't also have any complications related to diabetes at that point. She did not smoke and she was a teetotaler. So these were the examination findings at presentation. So as you can see, the duration was 0 years at diagnosis. The weight was 68 kgs, height was 155 with a BMI of 28.3. So she was obese and she had a waist circumference of 104 centimeters. She was hypertensive with a BP of 150 by 80. But there was, however, no evidence of either diabetic retinopathy or diabetic neuropathy. So these were the biochemical parameters at diagnosis. So we had an HbA1c which was 8%. Her fasting and postprandial glucose levels are clearly elevated. You have an HB which was normal. She had a normal creatinine and GFR. She had dyslipidemia in the form of raised LDL levels of 154 milligram per deciliter. Right, so this was the initial treatment that she was started on. She was advised physical activity of 30 to 45 minutes of brisk walking every day. She was advised a 1200 kilocalorie per day diet, and she was counseled by a registered dietitian. And she was put on these medications. She was put on metformin, 1000 milligrams once daily. Atorvastatin, she was put on 10 milligrams once daily, which was a moderate intensity statin. And she was put on telmisartan, 40 milligrams for the blood pressure. So this patient was very regular with her follow-up. She was a school teacher, so she was very compliant with her diet. She was compliant with her lifestyle measures. So she maintained a HbA1c less than 7%. She had an LDL that was less than 100, and she had a BP that was less than 130 by 80. So this was at 1 year. These were the so we had multiple follow-ups. I'm just presenting the important points in her medical history. So at 1 year follow-up, these were the findings that we had. So weight was 60 kgs, height was 155. With the waist circumference, she had managed to reduce the weight and the waist circumference. BMI was now 24.9. She had well-controlled blood pressure. There was no evidence of diabetic retinopathy or neuropathy. And these are the biochemical parameters. She had an HbA1c which was 6.6, very well controlled fasting and postprandial. Her creatinine and GFR were normal, LDL cholesterol was good. So she was on a good track. It was 5 years down the lane. So at this point, she was 52 years of age and she had suffered an ankle sprain and been advised bed rest for 3 weeks. So during this period, she was compliant with her medications and diet. However, she was unable to do her physical activity. And this led to a high blood pressure and probably led to a high blood pressure and poor glycemic control at this point. So these were the examination findings at this point. She had gained a little bit weight, 62 kgs, her waist circumference had increased, and her BP was on the higher side, 148 by 80, but she again had no evidence of either retinopathy or neuropathy. And these were the biochemical parameters. So she had an uncontrolled HbA1c of 8.2%, and she had raised fasting and postprandial glucose levels. Her creatinine was almost the same, but as you can see, the GFR is showing a downward trend, and her cholesterol was well controlled at this point. Right, so this was the treatment changes that we did. So this patient was on a gram twice daily, metformin 1000 milligrams twice daily of metformin. So that was continued. And we had added sitagliptin to this patient, 50 milligrams twice daily. And telmisartan was increased from 40 to 80 milligrams. And she was continued on the same dose of atorvastatin because the lipids were quite well controlled. So at this point, there are some things that I would like to discuss at this point. So was this medication uptitration appropriate? And would the maternal history of CKD alter this decision? So I'd like to invite all the audience to attend this this question that we have. What would be the most appropriate medication uptitration at this point? Should it have been addition of a sulfonylurea, a GLP-1 receptor agonist, an SGLT2 inhibitor, a thiazolidine-dione, or maybe a drug like orlistat? So which do you think would have been the right medication to use at this point? Can we have the polls active, please? Because it will take us a minute. So while we're waiting for that, Dr. Sahai, can we ask Dr. Sara or Dr. Manisha to comment on this, whether...
Yeah. Dr. Sara, would you like to comment on this?
Sure, but we will then affect the results. So,
Yeah.
so as I had walked through, so the most appropriate medication uptitration, if Ashwari, if you can put the case back up so that people have that on there as well. Are you able to?
Right.
So I can kind of walk them through the case.
Right.
Right. The initial one. Okay, this is fine. So as you see, the glycemic control is worsening at the duration of 5 years. In the middle, the A1C had been good at 6.6%. Now it is up to 8.2. And what Aishwarya had also pointed out too was that the GFR, although still okay, is showing a slight downward trend. So as we go forward, we also had her BMI, I believe. Let's go.
Yes, ma'am. I'll just pull
Yes.
this later.
Yeah. So when we look at that, there is, and the most important thing that I had mentioned was that you should look at what their renal function is, what their glycemic control is, what their cardiovascular risk factor is, right? And then choose between SGLT2 inhibitor or GLP-1 agonist as the second line. So when you look at the options over here, the only option that fits that is, Aishwarya, if you can go to the options. Sorry.
Next time.
Because I want to tell you why this. So sulfonylurea would not cause cardiovascular risk reduction, nor would it cause renal risk reduction, right? GLP-1 receptor agonist, if the patient's BMI had been quite significantly high, and if the cost would not an issue, you could consider it, but you are talking more about the CKD here as well. TZD is again not recommended, would also actually associate with increased heart failure risk and weight gain. And orlistat caused very minimal weight loss. So, Aishwarya, do we see what the audience has written?
We have the results from the audience poll.
Let's see if, how many chose.
So just to add to what Dr. Sarah already beautifully
We have the
demonstrated.
results from the audience poll also.
Okay, are they there? That's good.
We'll just see that and then we'll take the comments. Yeah, that is showing that 83% of the audience opted for adding a SGLT2 inhibitor and about 17% wanted to add a SU. Yeah, Dr. Manisha, you were adding something.
Yeah, so Dr. Sarah has already explained, but from a nephrologist point of view, though the GFR is fine and albuminuria is as of now within normal range, the patient has a risk of diabetic nephropathy because of the family history. So as of now, though the guidelines do not include the family history, but given the high BMI and the factors, the cardiovascular risk factors the patient has, the appropriate choice would be SGLT2 inhibitors. But as you know, in the guidelines, in the KDIGO 2020 guidelines as well, as of now, SGLT2 is preferred for renal risk reduction if you have GFR, which is low, or you have proteinuria, that's albuminuria, which is beyond 30 mg. So at this point, the patient didn't have that, but he is at an increased risk, because if both patients have diabetic nephropathy, your risk of having diabetic nephropathy goes up to 75%. That's a huge risk. And if one of the parents has diabetic nephropathy, your risk is around 30%. So you are at risk, you have those genes, and if the cost is not an issue, SGLT2 inhibitors would be good drugs to add.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am.
At this point of time, I would also like to take up a few questions which have come from the in the chat box. One is whether you would look at the DPP-4 inhibitors. You have shown, Dr. Manisha has shown about the DPP-4 inhibitors, their place in CKD. And do you have any preference for linagliptin is the question.
So as of now, as I said, linagliptin, it's more of renal safe. Renal benefit is to the tune of reduction in albuminuria, 14%. But the evidence of renal protection is robust with SGLT2 inhibitors, which is not there with DPP-4. And if not SGLT2, if they are not able to control, then the next drug to be added would be GLP-1RA. And we all know that as of now, the studies are going on, flow is going on, and the results of those are awaited because they have included patients with advanced renal disease as well. So as of now, as of today, as the evidence stands, SGLT2 is the first option.
Okay.
Could we go forward?
Should we move on to the next next
So to
slide?
summarize, at this point, so as Dr. Sara and Dr. Manisha nicely summarized, so in this patient, probably we could have done the switch to, instead of adding sitagliptin, we could probably have switched the patient onto an SGLT2 inhibitor. So moving on further, now this patient we again saw another 7 years later, and she was 59 years of age at this point. The diabetes duration at this point was 12 years. She was asymptomatic, but at this point, the urine examination revealed microalbuminuria. The urine albumin level was 54 milligram per gram of creatinine. And by this time, she did have changes of diabetic retinopathy in the fundus. So there was non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy bilaterally. So these were the examination findings. She had managed to bring her weight back down. She has 60 kgs right now with a BMI of 24.9. Waist circumference was also better than before, and her BP was under control, but she did have diabetic retinopathy. However, there were no changes of diabetic neuropathy as yet. And these were the biochemical parameters at 12 years. So you have 6.8% HbA1c. Fasting and PP was well controlled. She had an HB which was normal. Creatinine again remained the same. However, when you looked at the eGFR, it was declining. She had her lipids which were well controlled. And by this time, she had also developed microalbuminuria. So at this point, the prescriptions, the same medicines were continued. So another question for the audience. So was there an indication at this point to make any changes in the prescription? It's just a simple question of yes or no. Would you have liked to change anything in this patient's prescription? Right. So I'll move on while you're answering that. I'll move on to the next part of that. Ma'am, Dr. Manisha, would you like to comment at this point, ma'am? Considering that the patient had a good glycemic control, but albuminuria had happened, would this again have warranted a change in medication that the patient was on?
You have already, started the patient on SGLT2. If you have not done that before, you would do it now. So GFR is still maintained above 90. So that's pretty much normal. So though it's come down from the previous one, but again, you know that there are many fallacies with the GFR calculations, eGFR estimations as well. We don't have a validated eGFR equation for the Indian population. In fact, Pakistan has their own equation. India doesn't have. Sri Lanka doesn't have. So we use the MDRD or EPI equation. MDRD, you know, above 60, the GFR is not accurate. So EPI-GFR, the GFR values are fairly accurate. But for this patient, more than 90 GFR is quite okay. If I were to add SGLT2 inhibitor, if it had not been started before, it would be for the purpose of albuminuria. And I think the patient, if not on full maximally tolerated dose of ACE or ARB, that should be up-titrated as well, if that has not been done earlier.
She was already on telmisartan 80 milligrams twice daily. She was already on 80 milligrams once daily of telmisartan, so that was continued. Dr. Sara, do you think anything else could have been added or done at this point, ma'am? Do you feel other than...
No, I completely agree with Dr. Manisha's excellent overview of that. I think, yes, if not on SGLT2 inhibitor, then do it now, or I don't have anything else to add on this.
Yeah. So the important point to make here is that this patient, I mean, as you are presenting, I mean, the way she was managed, she was added, she was started on sitagliptin and metformin in the initial stages. So we all felt that, you know, SGLT2 inhibitor would have been a good choice at that point of time. So the point here is, again, even though she was attaining the glycemic targets with sitagliptin, it would still be worthwhile at this point of time to look at substituting one of these medicines, that is probably substituting sitagliptin with SGLT2 inhibitor with the current evidence that is available.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. So most of the audience also felt that. I can see that 55% of the audience felt that we needed to change the prescription, and 45% said that probably it was not required.
So that is the point that we would like to make, that at this point also with the currently available evidence, we would still think of substituting sitagliptin with the SGLT2.
Right. So moving on to the next time point, now it was another 3 years down the lane. So the duration of diabetes is now 15 years. The patient is 62 years of age, and now she has paresthesias in both her feet. No, she has bilateral proliferative retinopathy requiring photocoagulation. She also has clinically significant macular edema in the right eye. And she now has worsening creatinine, worsening EGFR, hypertension, and dyslipidemia. So these were the examination findings that we had at this point. So her weight was 63 kgs. Waist circumference was markedly higher at 108 centimeters, and she had a BMI of 26. The BP was grossly uncontrolled at 170 by 100, and she had diabetic retinopathy, which was proliferative, and she also had a macular edema, and she now had evidence of diabetic neuropathy. So these were the biochemical parameters at 15 years. So HbA1c was 7%. Fasting PP was fairly well covered, 114 and 182. And she had an HB that was 10. She had a creatinine that was 1.8 and an EGFR that was less than 30. And she had LDL cholesterol, which was elevated. And she now had a worsening of the albuminuria, which was around 800 milligram per gram of creatinine. And so this was a treatment that was given at this point. She was treated under ophthalmology for the retinopathy. She was given photocoagulation and anti-VEGF therapy. At this point, metformin was discontinued and sitagliptin was changed to linagliptin, and she was started on basal insulin of 10 units at bedtime. And the statin dose was now increased to 40 milligrams OD of atorvastatin. And this is after ensuring that she was adherent with the medication and with the dietary restrictions. Now, for the hypertension, loop diuretic and beta blocker was added. And at this point, an audience question again. So was there an indication for adding aspirin in this patient for primary prevention of cardiovascular disease? So you'll have to answer whether it was a yes or no. While you're answering, Dr. Sara, ma'am, will you like to comment on this?
Sure. So I think what's really important here is that this case is showing how, since some of the medicines we're talking about today may not have been available for this patient at that 5-year mark and so forth. What was her age at this time, Dr. Aishwarya?
Ma'am, she was 62.
62. Okay. So what we're seeing is that, although her diabetic control, her glycemic control was not that bad for the last few years, but she has gone on to progress in terms of her renal disease as well as retinopathy. So when we start seeing end organ damage to, one, and especially for her multiple, her cardiovascular risk needs to be assessed again, right? And for primary prevention, though, still aspirin is not recommended. The only thing here, though, is that in terms of history, what I would be doing now is ask her, is she having subtle signs of angina? A lot of times diabetics, especially women, do not have typical cardiovascular symptoms, right? So she may be having that. So you kind of look to find, because at the back of my head, I'm thinking she has 2 complications already. She probably has cardiovascular disease, and she may be having subtle signs which are missed, and which is a problem actually in women with cardiovascular disease and diabetes. We would try to look for subtle angina symptoms, dyspnea on exertion, shortness of breath, chest pressure, or any other kind of inability to be more active. If you are able to find one of those, then she is symptomatic. Remember in the guidelines I said, if you are symptomatic, then you would do cardiovascular risk screening as well and cardiovascular testing. But if she is actually asymptomatic, then you would not do the screening and you would not give aspirin. So that's the little caveat there.
Thank you. Could you go back to the previous slide and we'll take a comment on the decline in GFR that happened in the 3 years?
Yeah.
Dr.
So actually, I just wanted to point out diabetic patients, you have a faster decline in GFR. So normally, normal individuals, the GFR at 30 years, what we have, it becomes halved by 80 years. So 50 years, we have a fall. Suppose it's 100 at 30 years, it becomes 50 at the age of 80. So it declines by 1 ml per minute every year. So what happens in diabetics? The decline is 10 times faster. So it declines by 10 ml. So it's quite high. The other important point, what I wanted to make here was, in the antihypertensive therapy, she has been straight put on loop diuretics and thiazide diuretics, one of the diuretics. So is she already on calcium channel blocker? I don't know, I missed that.
No, ma'am, she wasn't on a calcium channel blocker, but she had been put on a loop diuretic and a beta blocker at that point.
Okay, so but generally what we do in the patients who have a low GFR and those who have CKD, after ACE or ARB, the second drug to be added is generally a calcium channel blocker. And we have so many calcium channel blockers available, so many blockers, the L-type, N-type, the LNN, LNNT, so many are there. As of now, the evidence doesn't favor one over the other, except that the non-dihydropyridine ones are not used. So the second drug of choice is generally a calcium channel blocker, and then we add a diuretic. If the GFR is more than 30, we go with a thiazide diuretic. And if the GFR is less than 30, we go with a loop diuretic. So that's how the hypertension is controlled. And if they have a cardiac specific indication, then obviously, I mean, a beta blocker for a specific indication, then it's used. So that's the way the antihypertensive therapy is managed in patients of CKD.
Yeah, and I think the other important point to highlight is uptitrating the ACE inhibitor or the ARB. When they develop, once they develop albuminuria, it is important to use the maximum tolerated doses.
Yeah, so that's what she said, Aishwarya, that she's already on the maximum prescribed dose of ACE-ARB. That's a very important point, what you said, because generally in India, what we find is because of the fear of hyperkalemia, subtherapeutic doses are given. So we have seen prescriptions with 5 milligram in April. It doesn't serve any purpose. You have to give 40 mg. So like that, again, there are tables available. There are guidelines available as to the maximum recommended dose. So maximum recommended dose, many of the Indians may not be able to achieve because of either hyperkalemia or cough. If cough is there, you can try with the ARBs. But however, if you are able to uptitrate to the maximum dose, you realize many of the times that the albuminuria does settle down. And whenever you are prescribing, as I showed, look out for other sources of hyperkalemia, look out for other sources of rise in creatinine. Sometimes bilateral renal artery stenosis may be common, or sometimes they may be taking fruit juices and coconut water, all those things that should be stopped. And in fact, the guidelines say you can add potassium binders. Adding and continuing ACE inhibitors and ARBs is that important.
Right. Well, can we have the results of the poll, please? I think I missed it. Yeah, so 63% felt that we should have added aspirin at this point, and 37% said no. But this point was well discussed by Dr. Sara that probably there was no indication for as such primary prevention, since this patient was asymptomatic for any cardiac issues. So we'll move on to the next audience poll. So which of the following statements is not true regarding statins in CKD? So statins are beneficial in early CKD. There is a less clear benefit of statins in advanced CKD and or end-stage kidney disease. Statins, including high-dose statins, are safe in CKD. And benefits of PCSK9 inhibitors extend right up to CKD stage 5. So we want the one statement which is not true in this. Which of the following statements do you think is not true regarding statins in CKD? This point was quite elaborately covered by Dr. Nadeem in her talk. So, shall we go ahead with the Dr. Sahai? Do you have any?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, so as was highlighted in the talk, the statins are beneficial in early CKD. There is enough evidence for that. But in ESKD, when the patient is on dialysis, there is not enough evidence. And as of now, the guidelines state that statins should not be initiated if the patient is on dialysis. However, those patients who are already on statins and are in stage 4 CKD and progress to dialysis, you can continue the statins. So statins, even high-dose statins, are safe in CKD. Generally, combinations of statins and fibrates are not used in CKD because of the fear of rhabdomyolysis. And the benefits of PCSK9, they extend up to GFR of 30, not in the terminal stages of CKD. So statins are very useful. And as I said in my talk, all CKD above the age of 50 years, statins should be a part of the prescription. And for diabetic CKD, right above the age of 18 years, statins should be a part of the prescription for CV risk reduction. And as I highlighted, the scores routinely used for ASCVD risk calculation are not applicable to CKD. But as of now, new scores are coming up where a patch is added, meaning you multiply it with a factor. So it automatically comes as a web-based application, and you can calculate the ASCVD risk in CKD patients as well. So many of them are at high risk, and that's the reason statins form an important part of the prescription.
Yeah. Could we ask Dr. Sara about the choice of statin therapy? Which one would you choose in diabetics?
So my easiest answer to that is the statin that the patient will actually take. As I struggle with a lot of, there is a lot of pushback in the media and online as well, and misinformation about statins. So that is my personal experience in clinical practice, that starting statins on a patient, when they come in, they bring their lipid panel or the lipid profile, and they're like, my cholesterol isn't that bad. And I actually spent 5 or 10 minutes trying to convince my diabetic patients that because you are diabetic, you're already at a much higher risk of cardiovascular disease and also kidney disease. And we do need to give you the statin, not just to treat that number, which is the lipid, but to actually reduce your risk for the complications that are there. So generally, I start with either simvastatin or atorvastatin in my practice, and try to up-titrate it. But again, I've had to switch many times to any statin that a patient will tolerate, including pravastatin, if they are having muscle aches and pains, because all muscle aches and pains, even though they may not be caused by the statin, are attributed to the statin. And so a couple of things that I'd suggest are coenzyme Q10 supplementation with statin in patients who may have a low threshold of side effects. And then I've in my fellowship days, actually, patients who completely denied and did not want any statin, we actually had red yeast rice available. There was a study out of Mayo Clinic which had shown that it has natural statin activity. So,
Unfortunately,
so any statin.
We have run out of time to finish this session now. So may I take this opportunity to thank all three speakers, Dr. Sara Nadeem, Dr. Manisha Sahi, and Dr. Aishwarya Krishnamurthy, for a wonderful session on the deadly duo in diabetes, CKD and ASCVD. And I also would like to thank Dr. Rakesh Sahi for being a very good moderator and continuing with the session. Thank you so much.